I was driving to my husband's funeral when I passed his car parked outside a house I had never seen before. By the end of that day, 12 years of my marriage turned out to be a lie. My name is Linda, and I'm 48 years old. 3 days before that drive, my husband Richard was supposed to come home from a business trip. He had been a structural engineer for almost 30 years, the kind of job that took him away every few months for site inspections in other states, sometimes other countries. I was used to his absences. We had built our entire marriage around that rhythm, him leaving, him coming home, me picking him up from the airport with the same easy hug we had been giving each other for 23 years. That Tuesday, his flight crashed during final approach. I got the call from the airline at 6 in the morning, and I don't remember most of what was said after the first sentence. I remember sitting on the kitchen floor with the phone still in my hand, and I remember our daughter Sophie, who is 21 and was home from college that week, coming down the stairs and finding me there. The days that followed moved in a strange kind of fog. There were calls to make, arrangements to handle, decisions about flowers and caskets and seating that felt impossibly small compared to what had actually happened. Richard and I had been together since I was 25. We met at a mutual friend's wedding, and somehow it had just worked from the very beginning. Two people who liked quiet evenings and didn't need much drama to feel content. We had one daughter, a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, and a marriage that I genuinely believed was solid. Not exciting in the way movies show marriage, but solid. Real. On the morning of the funeral, I drove myself, because Sophie had ridden ahead with my sister to help set up at the church. The route took me through a part of town I rarely had reason to visit, a quiet residential street about 20 minutes from our house. And that's when I saw it. Richard's car, the dark blue sedan he had driven for the last 4 years, parked in the driveway of a house I had never seen before in my life. I slowed down without meaning to. I told myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe a colleague lived there. Maybe someone was using his car for some reason I hadn't been told about. But even as I thought it, something in my stomach already knew that none of those explanations made sense. Richard had been on a flight back from a work site for the past 5 days. His car should have been sitting in our garage the entire time. I didn't stop. I didn't have time to stop, and honestly I don't think I was ready to. I kept driving, my hands tight on the wheel, and by the time I reached the church, I had convinced myself it must have been a different car, a similar model, a trick of stress and grief playing with my eyes. The funeral was full. Richard had been well-liked, the kind of person who remembered names and asked real questions, and the church was filled with colleagues, neighbors, old friends from college. I stood near the front with Sophie and my sister, accepting condolences in that distant way you do when your body is present but your mind is somewhere else entirely. It was during the second hymn that I noticed her. A woman, maybe my age or a little younger, standing alone near the back of the church. She was crying harder than almost anyone else in the room, but she was keeping herself apart, not approaching anyone, not speaking to the other guests. I didn't recognize her. I scanned my memory for any event, any work party, any context where I might have met her, and came up with nothing. After the service, as people gathered outside to offer their final condolences before the burial, I watched her get into a car and drive away alone. Nobody else seemed to notice her, or if they did, nobody mentioned it. But I couldn't stop thinking about her face, the particular kind of grief she was carrying, the way she had stood at the very edge of the room like she didn't believe she had the right to be closer. I buried my husband that afternoon under a gray October sky, surrounded by people who loved him. And the entire time, some part of my mind kept circling back to a blue car parked in a driveway I had never seen, and a woman crying at the back of the church who had no business being there at all. That evening after the burial, after the small gathering at my sister's house where people brought casseroles and said gentle, useless things about Richard being in a better place, I drove back to that street. I don't fully know why. Maybe I needed to see it again to confirm I hadn't imagined it. Maybe some part of me already understood that I wasn't going to find peace until I knew. The car was still there. I parked across the street, and I sat in my own car for almost 10 minutes before I found the courage to walk up to that front door. When I knocked, the woman from the church answered it. Up close, she looked exhausted in the same way I imagine I looked, the kind of exhaustion that comes from days of crying you can't fully explain to anyone around you. She didn't seem surprised to see me. If anything, there was a kind of resignation in her face, like she had been expecting this conversation since the moment she decided to attend the funeral. She asked me to come in and I did, and we sat across from each other in her small, neat living room while she told me everything. Her name was Karen. She and Richard had met 4 years ago on a flight back from one of his work trips, seated next to each other by chance, and they had talked the entire flight about nothing important and everything at the same time. She said it wasn't dramatic. Not the kind of affair you see in movies with stolen glances and desperate passion. It was quieter than that. They had simply found an ease with each other that neither of them expected, and somewhere over those first few conversations, it had turned into something neither of them had the courage to stop. She told me they hadn't meant for it to last. Both of them had told themselves in the beginning that it would fade, that it was just a strange comfort born out of loneliness and convenience, and that eventually they would each go back fully to their own lives. But it never faded. Instead, it became a second life that Richard maintained alongside the one he had with me, a quiet harbor, as she put it, somewhere he could simply exist without the weight of 30 years of routine. Karen told me that for the last 2 years, Richard had been planning to ask me for a divorce. She said he kept delaying it, not out of cowardice exactly, but because he didn't know how to dismantle 23 years of a shared life, a daughter, a house, all of it, without causing the kind of damage he didn't think he could face. She told me his business trips had often been shorter than he claimed, that he would spend the extra days here, in this house, in this quiet street I had never once had reason to visit. And she told me that the flight that killed him had been 3 days earlier than his official return date, because he had told his company he needed to come home early for a family matter. The family matter, she said quietly, was that he had finally decided to tell me the truth. I sat there absorbing all of it. I didn't feel anger the way I might have expected to. What I felt was something closer to a vast, quiet sadness, the kind that settles into your chest and doesn't ask permission to stay. Karen cried again while she spoke, and at some point she said she was sorry, genuinely sorry, that she had never wanted to hurt me, that some twisted part of grief had made her need to see him buried with her own eyes even though she knew she had no right to be there. I told her I wasn't there for an apology. I told her I just needed to understand. And when I finally stood up to leave, neither of us said anything else. There was nothing left that needed saying. I drove home in silence. Sophie had gone to stay at a friend's house that night, needing space of her own, so the house was completely empty when I walked in. I sat down at the kitchen table where Richard and I had eaten thousands of meals together, and I thought about the last 23 years in a way I had never allowed myself to before. I thought about how comfortable we had become, how settled, how quiet our life had grown around routines and responsibilities, and the slow accumulation of years. I wondered whether I had simply stopped truly looking at him somewhere along the way, the same way he must have stopped feeling truly seen by me. I wondered if I had buried myself in raising Sophie, in work, in the small daily tasks of keeping a household running, until I had forgotten to ask him the real questions, the ones that might have told me he was unhappy long before any plane ever left the ground. I didn't know if there had been love in our marriage at the end, or if it had simply become two people moving through familiar motions, mistaking comfort for connection. I didn't know if I had failed to notice him drifting, or if I had simply chosen, without realizing it, not to look closely enough to see it. 2 days later, I went to the cemetery alone, early in the morning before anyone else was likely to be there. I stood in front of Richard's grave for a long time before I spoke. I told him I forgave him for Karen, for the lie he had carried for 12 years, because I understood now that whatever he had found with her wasn't really about replacing me. And then I told him I was sorry too. Sorry for the years I had let pass without really asking him how he felt. Sorry for becoming so comfortable that I stopped paying attention to whether he was still there with me, fully the way a husband should be seen by his wife. I stood there until the cold finally pushed me to leave, and as I walked back to my car, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel that week. Not closure exactly, but the quiet beginning of understanding, the kind that doesn't erase the pain but finally gives it somewhere honest to rest.